President Donald J. Trump structured his campaign around many controversial ideas. One of the most notable being that he would build a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico to prevent illegal immigration into the U.S. Though he has retracted his ambition to build the entire wall out of concrete 30 feet high and 10 feet wide, he still maintains that there will be a continuous physical barrier on the border. The proposal is one of the hottest topics of discussion surrounding the new president, but few people are talking about what a continuous wall would do to wildlife populations occupying the border area. Wildlife species very rarely have an impassable barrier that blocks their movements pop up out of nowhere. More often than not, the biggest barriers they encounter without human intervention are things like rivers or canyons, which can take millions of years to form and pose a threat to the dispersal of wildlife. This gradual development of these barriers gives them a chance to migrate and adapt to the barrier over many generations. Building Donald Trump's wall would take several years but allow very little time for animals to adapt ways to cross it. Many species that now disperse freely across the border and connect populations on either side would suddenly be cut off permanently from one another. One of the most important factors contributing to a healthy regional population is connectivity among individuals and populations. Connectivity and regional gene flow contributes to both genetic diversity and demographic rescue, where connections between populations allow animals to recolonize areas where population numbers have dropped. Let's say we have a population of bighorn sheep over here and a population over here. Individuals can freely migrate between populations, breed, and exchange genes. Evolutionarily, this movement provides both populations with an external source of genetic diversity so that if disease strikes, there is a better chance that at least some of the individuals will be genetically resistant and the populations will survive. If we cut off gene flow between these two populations, genetic diversity will be limited and they are both more susceptible to disease. Now let's think about what would happen if one of these populations was experiencing a bad year for resources. For example, low levels of food. Individuals from that population are going to starve and survival will be low. The only way the bighorns will persist in that area is if a healthy population is able to contribute new sheep by providing an influx of individuals via dispersal. So if we build a wall in between the two populations and one of them has a bad year for resources, that population will suffer and may eventually go locally extinct if there are bad enough years and numbers continue to drop. There has been extensive research on how existing stretches of barriers along the US-Mexico border have affected wildlife populations in the area. Here are just a few. In addition, there are many other studies that show how other man-made barriers affect populations all around the world. Some species will be more at risk than others, depending on how they get around. For example, birds and other flying animals, as well as plants dispersing via pollen and seed, may be less susceptible to the effects of the wall. However, a study done in 2009 highlights how an impassable barrier along the US-Mexico border would affect the pygmy owl, a low-flying bird, in addition to the bighorn sheep. Let's take a closer look at the adorable pygmy owl. One of the main findings of the study was that only about 23% of the recorded pygmy owl flights exceeded a height of 4 meters, or about 13 feet. On top of this, their maximum flight height was directly correlated with the height of the vegetation in an area. So where there was higher vegetation, the owls flew higher. Where there was lower vegetation, the owl's flight stayed close to the ground. This is important because we see that currently along the border, fenced areas are disturbed or cleared of vegetation. The pygmy owls are low-flying to begin with, but without any vegetation, their flights become significantly lower. In this case, the proposed wall would then be a formidable structure for these little guys trying to disperse across the border, even though they can fly. This could greatly hinder populations on either side of the border from reaching each other, if not cutting them off completely. The case would be even worse for the desert bighorn sheep. Populations of these animals are highly sensitive to stochastic events and frequently go extinct in local habitat patches. Therefore, the bighorns rely on recolonization to restore populations in those areas. We know that past construction of roads in the US have already severed populations of bighorn sheep, greatly reducing genetic diversity and eliminating the possibility of recolonization in some areas. This study shows a web of connections between populations on either side of the border. There is no question that the ecological and evolutionary processes of species like the pygmy owl and bighorn sheep will be permanently affected if Donald Trump ends up building this wall. And these are just a couple of species that would be cut off from cross-border dispersal. Other articles suggest that ocelots, peccaries, pronghorns, and jaguars would also suffer consequences. This is a critical time for jaguars, and one in particular, El Jefe. This bad boy of the jaguar world is the last to reside in the US. The proposed wall would prevent any travel across the border, restricting his home range and ruining any chance of El Jefe finding a mate. No mate means no baby jaguars to recolonize the states. Some people might say that there is too much speculation and we really can't say for sure exactly what would happen to wildlife in the area. While we might not be able to predict every consequence the wall would have on these populations, scientists have collected immense amounts of data about what landscape barriers do to wildlife populations. Nature is difficult to pin down with precision. However, with the scientific evidence surrounding this topic, we can be certain that many wildlife will be negatively affected if this wall is built. Even if we aren't sure about the degree of harm it would cause, that is not a reason to avoid action. What if we heard that there was a 90% chance of heavy rain? Would we say, oh well, it's not definite, so I'll wear a white t-shirt and flip-flops? No, any sensible person would bring a rain jacket, umbrella, and rain boots. We know from previous efforts that barriers often introduce unforeseen consequences. For example, in the 1800s, farmers in southern Australia were losing their sheep to predatory wild dogs known as dingoes. So, a fence was built to keep the dingoes out, and it was certainly successful in doing so. However, dingoes are a predator of kangaroos, and in the absence of one of their most important predators in southern Australia, the kangaroo populations flourished. Removing the natural predator, in this case, created a new headache for the farmers since the kangaroos compete for the same food resource as their beloved sheep. The environmentally prudent thing to do would be to learn more about these border species and ecosystems before we erect the wall. Illegal immigration may be a problem we need to address, but hastily constructing this wall is too blunt a tool in a sensitive ecological context. It would be nice to think that we've made some progress since China tried out the same tactic over 2,000 years ago. Given how little of the ecology of these borderland ecosystems has been worked out, it's prudent to remember John Weir's thoughts on disrupting the environment balance. When we try to pick anything out by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. In the end, if we lose a few species due to restricted dispersal by the wall, we may find that they are supporting many other parts of that ecosystem.